So it seems that the new Necrons are looking very strong out of the gate, taking down the single biggest grand tournament on the first weekend of their Codex rules, and plenty of other high placings besides. Let's see what's being run, and the strongest units, Canoptek creations and detachments that the Tomb Worlds can bring to bear. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Necrons once more, and in this video I thought it would be interesting to see how Necrons are faring on the competitive scene. And out of all of their interesting and exciting new rules in the Codex, what's been translating from theory into reality in terms of good performance for the dynasties on the tabletop. Obviously it's very early days at the moment, only one weekend worth of tournament results, and we'll need a little bit more time to see how strong they actually are overall, but it does seem that they're not going to be weak. At least the strongest Necron builds out there, easily able to tangle with the very nastiest stuff in Warhammer 40k right now. Looks like they'll certainly be settling as one of the stronger 40k armies after the dust has settled. In just their first weekend they managed to win the biggest event of the weekend and also place highly at a bunch of others, though it's not like they're massively overpowered and completely dominant. There were plenty of other events that weren't won by Necrons or they didn't come close. Kind of predictably, given the new detachments, the Canoptek Court and the Hypercrypt Legion are the ones that are being played most. The Canoptek Court did just look like the one that had the most overall raw power. Big rerolls for a whole chunk of the Codex, including some very good units, plus some big tricks like being able to hide certain units from enemy shooting. The Hypercrypt Legion is the teleport one, the one that sort of feels like it wants to try and make you build around a monolith, though people are choosing not to, and just embracing teleporting Necron goodness to the max, and it is a particularly nice one for Catan, seeing as they're very powerful at the moment but also kind of slow, and this can get them where they need to be. It does feel like a lot of people's initial impressions of the codexes were kind of accurate. Some of the most common staples in these first competitive winning lists are Wraiths with Technomancers backing them up, really quite hardy, fast moving and dangerous units overall. Maybe not too hard to see why people are choosing to use those as the main thing to build around over Lichguard and Warriors these days. Catan Shards seem like a predictably easy include, and beyond that there is a fair amount of variation in supporting stuff, different firepower units, though things like Tomb Blades and Flayed ones seem to be fairly common staples for board control. It seems that the core strategy of the most competitive Necron lists, Warriors and Lichguard, aren't going to be the main things that people build around for the most part, but seeing that this is the only first weekend of experimentation, there might be a bit of an element of embracing as much new stuff as possible, and there might still be some good play for them. In any case, in this video I thought we'd jump through 4 strong Necron lists over the past week's events, see what people are running in armies that have gone 4-1 or better at tournaments, and focus on the datasheets of a couple of strong units per list. First up for the big grand tournament winning one, the most impressive Necron result of the weekend was this one by Colin McDade, who played with this army list to take first at Rise of Empire, an 89 player grand tournament going 6 wins to no losses, and taking a rather brutally honed looking Canoptek Court list, very much focusing on the new big nasties of the Necron Codex, almost all the points invested in Wraiths plus Catan, and then just a few supporting units to score secondaries and things. The Canoptek Court is the army list that gets you a power matrix that allows you to reroll hits with your Canoptek or Cryptek units within its zones, so make the Wraiths go from kind of okay damage dealers to actually kind of good against the right targets. They should definitely be able to chew through the majority of sort of medium infantry type units. It's also got some big shenanigans that you can play with the Canoptek Wraiths as well, meaning that you can have them move 6 inches when the enemies move near to them, and Cantemporal Shift, the one that allows you to stop them being shot from greater than 12 inches away. Kind of massive if you have a unit that's holding down an objective and suddenly you just make a whole load of your opponent's firepower unable to shoot them at all, even if they want to. As the target for those, there's 3 massive units of Wraiths here, 3 units of 6 of them with Particle Casters and Vicious Claws, backed up by 3 Technomancers with the 5+ Feel No Pain, and one of them taking the Dimensional Sanctum. That's the one that grants Infiltrate to a unit, so you could have Wraiths basically in the midfield and ready to charge the opponent turn 1 if you wanted, potentially trapping the opponent in their deployment zone. Beyond this, there's a trio of Catan that I feel like are almost auto-included in Necron lists now, though it does seem that plenty of other competitive lists are choosing to pass them up for other things, so maybe not. But just their raw stats for the cost are truly outstanding now they gain that 5+ Feel No Pain. There's the Nightbringer with his massive d6+2 damage, the Void Dragon with his enormous anti-vehicle things, and the Transcendent Catan for bouncing around the table with the advance move and putting a bit more pressure on the opponent. All of these guys are so tough that unless your opponent's managing to focus something truly extraordinary in terms of damage output on them, they're probably not going to get killed in one round and then can start reanimating their way back to health. Then beyond that, it looks like it's mainly just a little bit of secondary objective and skirmishing type support, 1 unit of 5 Flayed ones, allowing some deployment in the midfield, 2 units of 3 Tomb Blades with Shadow Looms. They can move, shoot, move now, so can skirmish with enemies or just move extra far when needed, a single Lonely Locust Heavy Destroyer, and a Hexmark Destroyer with his Lone Operative protection. I guess could be handy to deep strike down to do secondaries, or even just sit on the primary objective if it's safe to do so. Overall, just looks hugely enormously scary. 6 massive threats that take just an extraordinary amount of damage to take down are really quite threatening in themselves, and the Wraiths can pull all sorts of fun command point tricks as well, preventing shooting and doing reactive movements to put the enemy on the back foot. I perhaps wouldn't be too surprised if competitive Necron lists are going to be looking pretty Catan and Wraith heavy going forward. For a look at a couple of the units, as I feel like everyone noticed when the Codex came out, the Wraiths really did seem to be big winners out of the Codex. 110 points per unit of 3 of these Canoptek horrors, phasing around a big 10 inches per turn with 4 wounds and a 4+ invulnerable save. These guys are now both faster and a fair bit tankier for their cost, and are pretty much back to being a durable front line that you can push up the board and trust not to take too much damage and likely survive to do a bit of reanimation. The favoured loadout for these ones certainly seems to be the Particle Casters and the Vicious Claws. The Particle Casters are pretty much better against just about every target given their devastating wound output, and the Vicious Claws give them a bunch of attacks at strength 4, AP -1 and damage 2. Maybe not really the most combat damage unless you're in the Canoptek court with the big rerolls to hit, but for such a fast and durable unit I think they do pretty fine against anything that's sort of medium toughness. Leading them into battle will be the Technomancer, 60 points for a 5+ Feel No Pain save for those Wraiths, and at toughness 6 with a 4+ invulnerable save and the Feel No Pain going on, there's very little that will kill them efficiently at all. He also chips in with some extra healing, so you might be able to heal one further one up to full health, or he could even spare that healing for a passing Catan if there was one nearby. He doesn't really have too much damage with a few Staff of Light attacks, but he can bring enhancements to the unit as well. Things like the Infiltrate in the Canoptek court. I think there's plenty of other pretty reasonable ones. Otherwise though, that certainly wasn't the only other Necron army list hitting the top tables over the past weekend. Here's one example from the Hypercrypt Legion, the teleporting Necrons that can phase out a certain amount of units across the board and then redeploy either via strategic reserve or deep strike if they have it. They also have that stratagem to phase a unit to just somewhere just outside of 3 inches of the enemy, so basically warp a unit into somewhere very, very threatening. This first example was run by Jonas Axelsson, who used it to take 6th at Grimdark 18 GT4, a 50-player grand tournament, getting 4 wins and 1 loss. The single loss was to Death Guard round 1. The Hypercrypt Legion sort of feels like it. Games Workshop really wanted to make people take a monolith for that. I feel like it's certainly reasonable enough, though it's not mandatory, and it seems that neither of the Hypercrypt Legion lists chose to actually run one and instead ran other things. Kind of interesting that this one didn't run any Catan as well, as it also seems to be fairly standout for them to get those scary damage and defensive profiles in close. This one basically seems to be shooty hyperphase Necrons, no less than 3 Doomsday Arcs, which maybe have the main disadvantage of trying to get line of sight on their foes. If the opponents had deployed in a way where their units were screened and you weren't going to be able to get lines of sight on them, you could potentially phase them out and move to another location, and just line up an enormous deletion laser with all those Doomsday cannons to take down one target. If they can stay still and get all the benefits from that, then so much the better. But either way, their scary firepower coming in at only 200 points now and strength 18. Otherwise though, perhaps the most reliable users of the return to reserves and then redeploy for big shooting type things are the 2 units of 6 Locust Destroyers. They're really quite general purpose shooting with their Gauss cannons, only 24-inch range so they could use the redeployment occasionally, and each of them gets an attached Locust Lord, getting them lethal hits on a 5+ due to the critical hits, and that pairs really nicely with the 4 reroll hits that they can get if they can target an enemy unit that's closest and on an objective. Means you could be getting an awful lot of lethal hits with those Gauss cannons and just auto-wounding the enemy with -2 and 2 damage. Both of those get a Resurrection Orb as well to potentially restore a bunch of destroyers to life, and one of them gets the Osteoclave Fulcrum to allow Deep Strike, so that one would have very flexible Deep Strike setup options each time it goes back into hyperphase. Otherwise, to support them you do need an Anvil of Forces to actually take the objectives and not be jumping all over the board, and again Wraiths seem to be the choice here. 2 units of 6 Wraiths with Particle Casters and the Vicious Claws, one of them headed up by a Technomancer. He's taking the Hyperspatial Transfer node for an automatic advance of 6 if you need to get somewhere in a hurry, and then really quite a lot of mid-board control with a unit of 10 Flayed ones and then 2 units of 5. Potentially that's a lot of units that could really hem the opponent back early on in the game and allow you plenty of places to deep strike if that's critical, or just have a fair few bodies to hide on midfield objectives and score points. Overall certainly looks like some terrifying general purpose firepower though. Just about every army in the game has got to seriously fear 3 Doomsday Cannons plus a whole bunch of auto-wounding Locust Destroyer fire, particularly when you could do big things like deep strike a unit within 3 inches of the enemy somewhere in their own deployment zone and light up a whole load of people with Gauss fire right from the backfield. Focusing on a couple of those units, and Locust Destroyers definitely got a bit of an improvement in the new Codex. They're still remaining 30 points, though they gained a little bit of movement, going at 8 inches rather than 7. And they had their special rule improved, so you get to reroll or hit rolls against enemy units on objectives with those Gauss cannons. If you combine that with the Locust Lord and you're getting lethal hits on a 5+, you can just reroll everything that isn't a 5, and then try and get as many auto wounds as possible on things that you might have struggled to wound otherwise. Again, say something like a Space Marine Repulsor Executioner with a 3+ save, you average around 14 wounds with the Locust Lord's buff, and they're a lot more murderous to any lighter infantry that they might be wounding on a 4+ or 3+ natively. Just very, very scary general purpose firepower units, and with the Resurrection Orbs they can reanimate quite quickly as well. Flayborns do seem to be really quite popular infiltrators in a few of these lists as well. 70 points for a unit of 5 of these to start in the midfield. Most commonly used in small units, though it seems like a big unit of 10 it can certainly hold its own at tournament level. Despite stealth, they really aren't all that tough per point, only toughness 4 with a 4+ save. They are genuinely very threatening to any sort of light or medium infantry though. A unit of 5 of them averages around about 3 dead Space Marines on the charge, and does kind of murderous things to anything that's less well armoured. Just having units to hold down the midfield definitely has advantages of its own though, and gives you a lot of board control. Moving on to our third list, and we have another very different Canoptek court, this one completely eschewing the Catan, and instead running a whole bunch of Immortals and Doomstalkers. This one was another list that did well at that Rise of Empire GT, run by Warren Lauderdale, and placing in 9th overall, going 5-1, only losing to Eldari round 3 apparently. Necron Immortals and Canoptek courts was definitely one of the combos that the internet has been getting really quite excited about over the past few weeks. This is out in force here with 2 big units of 10 of them with the Tesla carbines, one of them headed up by an Overlord with a Translocation Shroud, one of them potentially by Immortals the Stormlord, and both units take a Plasmancer to allow them to get their sustained hits on a 5+, plus also chip in with a bit of mortal wound damage of their own. Then the idea is to point these guys against enemies on objectives, they get their full reroll wound rolls, and then you can use the 2 command point stratagem to get devastating wounds on each of them, one for free with the Overlord, and the other one for 2 CP, which I guess Immortals will help fund. In theory land, if you can target things on objectives, that gets you around about 12 devastating wounds on just about anything in the game. But you still get 6 devastating wounds even against things that aren't on objectives, so it's not exactly wasted if you're not. And they can do this while advancing as well, so could be moving forwards to get their objective control on those points themselves. Perhaps their biggest weakness is that they aren't enormously tough for the cost, but it's still pretty terrifying damage output and moves really quite fast with good OC. Otherwise there's Wraiths and Technomancers again, 2 Technomancers and 2 units of 6 Wraiths. One Technomancer takes the Dimensional Sanctum, and again with the Canoptek court, both these guys and the Immortals will be re-rolling hit rolls a lot of the time due to the power matrix. There's 2 units of Flayed ones to start in the midfield and maybe help get the power matrix going early. 3 individual Locust Heavy Destroyers, each with heavy Gauss cannons, nice enough cheap placeholders that can also threaten some enormous anti-tank, and 3 Skirmishing Tomb Blades with Gauss Blasters. Then for some heavy guns in the backfield, there's 3 fairly scary Canoptek Doomstalkers. If they can stay near to their deployment zone, or you can push out the power field to further, then you get to reroll hit rolls with them all the time, which is just an enormous damage increase for such a scary weapon profile. Lots of solid anti-tank shooting there to back up those Immortals, plus a Canoptek Reanimator as well, proving that those guys aren't dead. Not 100% sure what he's aimed to be supporting. I guess he could hang around with the Doomstalkers, though he could be very valuable to have near the Wraiths as well. I just have a feeling that online discussioners maybe donkey on these guys a bit too hard given the big points decrease. They still have the single best reanimation buff in the Codex. Overall really quite cool to see another take on the Canoptek court, and shows that those Immortals can definitely do some work in practice as well as theory, and quite nice to see another Necron list not leaning too heavily on the Catan. For standout units here, Immortals definitely look a lot more interesting in the new Codex. People seem to be a lot more hyped for them than Warriors after the book update. The points decrease just doesn't really seem to have been doing enough to outweigh the Gauss Reaper nerf, and more importantly their reanimation getting cut down quite so brutally. Immortals are 70 points for 5, or 140 per 10. For the most part I've been more tempted by the Tesla carbines given the range increase now. 2 shots at strength 5, AP 0, damage 1, but sustained hits 2, and might often get paired with Plasmancers for getting those criticals on a 5+. They can be pretty strong anti-infantry clearance in just about any one of the detachments. They can all access full hit rerolls in one way or another, but they are particularly devastating in Canoptek Court, where they can get devastating wounds for 2 CP, potentially for free with an Overlord, as you can basically just reroll everything that isn't a 6 due to their implacable eradication rule, rerolling wound rolls against things that are on objectives. Otherwise, I thought that Tombblades might be worth a shout out as well. These guys were being run at least fairly commonly prior to the Codex, just being scout move units with massive movement values. In the Codex they got a bit cheaper, though a little bit easier to kill, but gained a fairly godly move shoot move ability, meaning they've got the speeds to jump all the way into the enemy deployment zone turn 1 if it makes sense to. Between scout and then a move, then potentially advance, shoot, and then move once more. I'd probably be tempted to have at least 1 Tesla carbine in the units to allow you to do that second movement after advancing if it makes sense to. Seems like a pretty ideal unit for reaching hard to get 2 points, or jumping around to get secondaries that are going to be out of reach otherwise, or even doing big move block shenanigans against the enemy army. Finally, for our last list of the 4, there's a second Hypercrypt Legion list here, and this one is really showcasing a rather terrifying level of Catan spam run by an Iñaki Ariata, who went 4 wins to 1 loss at a WTC tournament in Madrid. The Katana definitely the standout feature here. There's a Nightbringer and a Void Dragon on the board, both of which are the ones with the massive damage output that can threaten even very, very heavy vehicles with huge damage output, and then 2 Transcendent Katans. They get access to Deep Strike and can warp themselves across the board without any help from the detachment rule. They all have enormous stats and are ridiculously hard to take down, with the 4+ invulnerable save, halving damage, and the 5+ feel no pain now, and reanimation protocols to regenerate some fantastically tanky wounds for each one that you manage to half kill but not finish off. The Hypercrypt Legion is probably the best attachment for them, as it actually helps get them where they need to be, with the Deep Strike rule that allows you to teleport a unit to somewhere that's just outside of 3 inches of the enemy army. You could be landing a Nightbringer in the enemy deployment zone turn 2, or a Void Dragon if that makes more sense. The Transcendent Katans can just get around with their own rule, or using the detachment one for some chance to drop and then charge. Otherwise, for the rest of them, there's a bit of heavy fire support, plus some objective capping units. A Technomancer with a big unit of Wraiths, as that seems almost mandatory these days. They can be a durable unit to take and hold a midfield objective against enemy attacks. 2 units of 5 Lich Guard, which are kind of fun to see. I'm not really too surprised that these guys are being run just as durable infantry in their own right. 17 points for toughness 5 and a 4+ invulnerable save with those shields is rather nice. 3 units of 2 Locust Heavy Destroyers. 2 squads both take the Enmitic Exterminators and 1 takes the Gauss. I guess it really doesn't hurt to have a bit more point and delete horde clearance, given that the list probably has enough threats to be able to handle the really heavy hitters. And 2 units of 3 Tombblades with Shadow Looms and Tesla carbines. Pretty excellent for doing secondary objectives. Again, overall looks pretty terrifying. Those Katana are just going to be a massive stat check on whether the opponent managed to bring both a fairly scary amount of anti-tank and also managed to try and outplay the Necrons on the objective games while they try and handle them. Having 4 of them run around different areas of the board all at once feels like it would be a massive overload, particularly as you could fling 2 Transcendent Catan up into the opponent's face turn 1 if you wanted. Overall very scary looking, and I'm sure we'll be seeing lots more Catan in competitive Necron lists going forward. In any case, let me know what you make of the army lists, any other insights as to how they were played, or any other thoughts of competitive Necron list building going forward are always appreciated down in the comments. If you'd like to see a little bit more discussion on the Catan, I'll leave a link to my review of them down in the video description. It seems in these first competitive lists they haven't been quite auto-include, though I feel like at the points cost that they are at the moment, they're never really going to be a particularly wrong choice. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. And if you have been enjoying quite a few videos on the channel, then I would also like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.